No country, no people suffered so terribly in the war as the Soviet Union. Nowhere else are the memories of war so alive today and so profound. The German invasion brought about a catastrophe which it seemed at first no nation could survive. In the siege of Leningrad alone, which lasted for over 2 years, more human beings died than the total war dead of Britain and the United States combined. Yet it was here that Hitler was broken. The Russian people faced the possibility that they might perish and overcame it.
We are hoping for the victory. We are quite sure that the victory will come sometime. We hoped that our hardships would end.
Kharkov, under German occupation, 1942. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf, "The colossal empire in the East is ripe for dissolution, and the end of Jewish domination in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state." The Soviet system was to be demolished. But there was more. It was in Russia that Hitler would find Lebensraum, new territory for German colonization. The Soviet peoples would be treated as mere natives in a German colonial empire. Their cities would be Germanized or razed to the ground. They would be peddlers, backward peasants, domestic servants, laborers. Communists and intellectuals were exterminated. The least sign of defiance brought instant reprisal.
The occupiers were harsh, very harsh, especially in those areas where the partisans were active. In the Ukraine, 511 villages were burnt down by the Nazis before the population could escape. In one village, Pisk, near Kiev, which was totally razed to the ground, babies were thrown into the fire.
Before the war, the regions now occupied by the Germans had produced nearly 3/4 of the country's coal and iron, 1/3 of its beef and grain, almost all its sugar. By autumn 1941, the Germans controlled what had been the industrial and agricultural heart of the Soviet Union. The invaders found that the Russians had tried to destroy everything they had to leave behind. Villages burned, the summer harvest flamed in the fields around them. By that autumn, the Germans had advanced for 600 miles over scorched earth. In some of the Baltic republics, which had only been annexed by the Soviet Union a year before, the Germans were made welcome by local nationalists. In parts of the Ukraine, and some of the peasants made the traditional offering of bread and salt. The bodies of nationalists shot by the Soviet security at the last moment were brought out and carried through the streets. For a brief moment, it seemed to some that these submerged nations might become willing partners of the Nazis. Communists were hunted down. And in all the places the Nazis occupied, the roundup of the Jews began. In the path of the Germans, Russia seemed to be crumbling away. Stalin had the defeated commander of the Western Front and his staff arrested and shot. Monuments of Soviet construction, even the Dnieper Dam, the very symbol of the 5-year plans, had to be blown up and abandoned. Locomotives were wrecked, though they were needed as never before. For there now began a planned evacuation which in the end was to save Russia and change the course of the war. "1,500 factories moved on 18,000 trains, with over 1 million workers to the safety of Eastern Russia and the Urals. One witness said, it was as if the earth tilted up and everything human or mechanical rolled from west to east.
Завода там никакого не было. Были там склады.
There was no factory when we arrived. There were only storehouses where materials were kept.
Наша задача состояла в том, чтобы эти
We began by emptying the stores and clearing the land around us.
очистить склады и очистить.
We were working up to 14 hours a day.
In bleak places, lacking food or sleep, the Russians reconstructed a new war industry beyond the reach of the Nazis.
Работали по 12-16 часов.
When we'd emptied the storehouses, the machinery arrived. And where the warehouses used to be, we built a new factory.
Ой, ты песня, песенка девичья, ты лети за ясным солнцем вслед, и бойцу на дальнем пограничье от Катюши передай привет.
Unlike the Germans, the Russians from the first hour waged a total war. Every pair of hands was set to the machines as the men were drafted into the battles of the West. War work strained everyone to the heart. 11 to 15 hours a day, rations short, worry about a husband or a son at the front, exhaustion like a permanent illness. But for the cameras, they wore a cheerful, determined face. Now the Germans were breaking through to Leningrad, Russia's second city and capital of the revolution. The workers were given rifles. Harking back to the days of revolution, Leningrad's leaders encouraged the whole city to stand and fight. Untrained, they marched out to face the panzers within sight of their own factory chimneys. The chance to get non-combatants out of Leningrad was missed. Anyway, most families preferred to stay.
My husband, he got 2 places on a plane, and he asked me certainly to take the child and go with him, but I refused because I couldn't left my mother and his mother, my mother-in-law, here in the besieged city. So I told him to take the old lady with him, and I remained in Leningrad with my mother and child.
In September, the German ring closed. Over 2.5 million people were trapped in the city, 400,000 of them children. Leningrad's only link with Russia was across Lake Ladoga. The greatest of all sieges was beginning. Now Stalin intervened. Marshal Voroshilov, in command of Leningrad, was sacked. In his place was sent Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who was to become one of the great commanders of the war. His deputy was the hard and resourceful Andrei Zhdanov, Leningrad's Communist Party chief. Leningrad soon felt the new team's determination. Outside the city, Zhukov threatened that anyone who retreated further would be shot. Inside, the security forces hunted down spies and defeatists. Zhdanov's men ended the wastage of food, mobilizing everybody for the city's defense. Every major building was mined in case the Germans broke in. But the German attempt to take Leningrad by storm failed. Berlin ordered, "The Führer has decided to raze the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth. There is no reason for the future existence of this large city." The Leningraders were to be bombarded and starved to death. Day after day, the bombers came over. German gunners could see the spires of Leningrad from their lines. Their shells could strike every district, every street. Lake Ladoga remained the only gap in the enemy ring. When it froze, an ice road for supplies was built across its surface. Trucks fell through the ice or were destroyed by air attack. The ice road could bring too little in and take too few civilians out to keep Leningrad from the onset of starvation. Everything was running out. The trams and buses stopped. In the darkness and intense cold of the North Russian winter, there was no longer heating or electric light. Workers, half conscious with hunger, kept the arms factories turning, even when shells had torn off the roof. Tanks of raw, unpainted steel drove out of the factory into the front line. Bread was now made with sweepings, cattle cake, sawdust. People ate soap, linseed oil, the paste for wallpaper. Housewives and children got only 4.5 ounces of this bread a day. Frozen and silent, Leningrad refused to die. The libraries stayed open. People took inspiration from the new literature of the blockade.
Poetry was for us a great force that kept us alive.
For what they say of Leningrad is true. The tears have frozen in the people's eyes. We cry no longer, for no tears could quench our burning hate. And hate is our only course, the guarantee of life, the cure for grief, the one uniting, warming, guiding force.
And the end of November, December, and January were the most tragical times. Firstly, it was cold, -40. Then the famine and the hunger began to be felt. And people began to starve and to die from cold.
The siege went on. There were few ways to hit back at the Germans. One was with naval guns from the warships trapped in the port. On land, small raiding parties penetrated behind the German trenches. They cut supply lines, they captured prisoners, and collected information. They descended on collaborators and tried them on the spot. January 1942. About 4,000 people were dying in Leningrad each day.
I went to the shops to receive my ration for my family. If I passed on the way there 2 bodies, so on the way back there were 4.
Outside the ring, the Russians fought to loosen the German blockade and speed up the pitifully slow convoys across the frozen lake. But there was no major offensive to break the siege ring, and no airlift. The battles before Moscow had first call on men and equipment. Spring brought new fears. The murderous cold slackened, but melting snowdrifts revealed thousands of corpses in the streets and yards. The campaign was launched to clean up the city. was no epidemic. Now the ice road was melting. Although there would be a difficult time before the lake was clear for ships, the mood in Leningrad was turning confident.
When the sun began to shine and we began to clean and to wash, because now we had water in our homes, we began to feel normal again.
The city council dared to send a few trams back on the streets.
We greeted the tram as a long-forgotten friend coming back to us. I remember I clapped my hand when I saw the tram running along Lithuania.
The survivors felt stronger. Their rations were increased. Squads of young volunteers went from house to house, bringing help to families who in the winter had almost lost contact with the city outside. Children who should have been evacuated 8 months before were taken by ship across Lake Ladoga. The ships brought back fresh troops and munitions to relieve the gaunt men in the trenches. Leningrad began to look more like a military base. The worst of the siege was over. Though the bombardment went on, it now made sense to repair the damage. Peat was dug for fuel against the next winter. School children and professors of botany helped to plant every open space with vegetables. There were no worries about food for the Germans occupying the prairies of the Ukraine. For 50 years, German expansionists had looked to this region to free Germany from dependence on imports by sea. General Manstein said, a large part of the population will have to go hungry. Nothing, out of a misguided sense of humanity, may be given to the population unless they are in the service of the German Wehrmacht. In Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, plans to win over local nationalists with the promise of an anti-Russian puppet state never got off the ground. They were brushed aside by the army and the SS. The reality was work under German overseers or deportation to the Reich. Each village learned the price of defiance. In Moscow in early 1942, there was confidence. The winter fighting had revealed that the Germans were no more invincible than Napoleon had been. But it seemed to the Russians that they were bearing the whole burden of the war against fascism alone, and that the West was not doing enough. When Stalin began to call for a second front, a landing in the West, the people joined willingly in the meetings organized to support it. Molotov, the foreign minister, was told by Western diplomats that though they admired the heroism of the Red Army, A second front was not yet practical. Stalin didn't believe them. Stalin was in direct command of an army becoming harder and more formidable every day. But the Russians did not pretend to be immune to grief. Tens of thousands knew this poem by heart. Wait for me, and I'll return. Only wait very hard. Wait when you are filled with sorrow as you watch the yellow rain. Wait when the winds sweep the snowdrifts. Wait in the sweltering heat. Wait when others have stopped waiting, forgetting their yesterdays. Wait even when from afar no letters come to you. Wait even when others are tired of waiting. Wait even when my mother and son think I am no more. And when friends sit around the fire drinking to my memory, wait, and do not hurry to drink to my memory too. Wait, for I'll return, defying every death. And let those who do not wait say that I was lucky. They never will understand that in the midst of death, you, with your waiting, saved me. Only you and I will know how I survived. It's because you waited, as no one else did. There were still disasters to come. In May, the Germans beat off a Russian offensive near Kharkov. As the Red Army advanced, the panzers cut round its flanks. The Soviet commanders begged to be allowed to pull back before it was too late. But Stalin, pushing advice aside, forbade them to retreat. The German pincers closed. Most of the men of 3 Russian armies were forced to lay down their arms. In the whole war, over 5 million Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. Less than 2 million survived. For the British especially, the Russians were now our gallant Soviet allies. But at first, help could only come through the Arctic convoy, heading for Murmansk and Archangel, through the killing ground of the German U-boats, bombers, and warships. In July 1942, this one convoy lost 80% of its ships. But the courage of British seamen could not make the convoys carry enough for Russia's gigantic needs. 1942 was the year of deep war. Defeat fought off, but as yet no sign of victory. This was a time of bitter endurance, a season for learning to bear disappointment and loss. Once it seemed possible that German soldiers were only brother workers in uniform. Now, Soviet writers spoke in words of hate. One can bear anything, the plague, hunger and death. But one cannot bear the Germans. One cannot bear these fish-eyed oafs contemptuously snorting at everything Russian. We cannot live as long as these grey-green slugs are alive. Today there are no books. Today there are no stars in the sky. Today there is only one thought. Kill the Germans. Kill them all and dig them into the earth. Then we can go to sleep. Then we can think again of life and books and girls and happiness. We shall kill them all, but we must do it quickly, or they will desecrate the whole of Russia and torture to death millions more people. As the Soviet soldiers advanced, they found what Germans had been doing to civilians. The churches were full once more. The priesthood was invited to pray for the life of Holy Russia, to work on the patriotism of the worshippers. The icons were honored again. The public campaign for atheism was dropped. The Germans murdered Jews and communists. They murdered those suspected of supporting the partisans. They murdered hostages. After battle, in retreat, they just murdered. To the north, the Russians prepared to attack the German ring round Leningrad. As they waited, runners brought the news of the surrender of the German armies at Stalingrad. For army and people, this was the sudden glow of victory at the tunnel's end. Now they knew they would win. At Leningrad, the relieving troops broke through. They forced open a land route. The 16-month blockade was over. But they did not break the siege. The Germans and Finns still lay around the city.
It was such a feeling I found related. I went to my neighbor across the yard, and we kissed each other and told each other, now we shall live. There is a way out.
In a fortnight, a railway was laid through the gap. Food and fuel began to roll into Leningrad. The symbols of old Russian honor were restored to the army as they had been to the church. Propaganda united Lenin with Alexander Nevsky. The 18th century hero Suvorov. Heroes of the Red Cavalry, mighty ghosts cheering forward the avengers of the Soviet motherland. The insignia of a traditional and professional army were brought back. Gold braid was imported from Britain. Political commissars lost rank. The years of the purges were forgotten.
Every Soviet citizen felt himself a part of the common struggle. Some people say it was the fascist cruelty which led to resistance in the Ukraine and other occupied lands. No. I believe resistance was inevitable. Soviet people in the rear could not hold themselves back from the struggle.
In 1941, behind the lines, partisan bands began to form. At first they lacked arms. They grew slowly. German deportations for forced labor made thousands flee to the forests where they joined the partisans. Soon the partisans became a formidable army operating against the enemy lines of communication. The penalty for collaboration was death. On the mere suspicion of sympathy for the enemy, whole national groups, the Volga Germans, the Crimean Tatars, were deported to Central Asia. For individual collaborators, no mercy. As German prisoners were paraded through Leningrad, people struck out at an enemy they could reach. In the steppes of Soviet Asia, in the new factories and mines of Siberia, the most desperate production effort of modern times was coming to its climax. Russia had been caught with obsolete aircraft, unfit for close battle support. Now the plants turned out 9,000 modern aircraft every month. In 1943, military output finally outstripped Germany's. Above all, it was the tank. In 1943, the factories built 24,000 of them. More than any other weapon, it was the tank, especially the famous T-34, which won the battle on the Eastern Front. With the American trucks now streaming in from Persia, this torrent of armor moved up to the line. The Russians knew that in July 1943, the Germans would launch their full strength against them once more. They knew too that the blow would fall at Kursk. They must hold firm. Then, the Red Army, now the biggest land force ever seen in war, would strike back. The Germans planned to drive into the shoulders of the Kursk Bulge, hoping to cut off the huge Soviet armies there. Then hit at Moscow. They brought up 70 divisions, almost 1 million men, with the new Tiger tanks and Ferdinand guns. Hitler had intended to strike in May, but there were delays in production and building up reserves. Weeks passed. When the Germans were ready to attack, the Russians were waiting for them.
Мы все готовились, и очень тщательно.
We were all prepared. We were more than ready to meet Hitler's attack. We knew we had enough armor to stop the fascists breaking through our defenses.
Разведчики наши захватили пленных. Разведчик, сапер Vermelha.
Our reconnaissance patrols had captured prisoners.
Что гитлеровские войска
And then we learned that Hitler's troops planned to start the attack at 2:30 in the morning on July the 5th. The news was given to our troops.
Когда сидит командир,
a commander sits in the observation post, the soldiers are in the trenches, and tomorrow the enemy is expected to attack.
какая у всех мысль в это время
You can imagine what thoughts are in his mind.
Останется он жив или не останется? Ведь на 1 километр шло по 100 танков и больше.
There were more than 100 tanks every kilometer. When tanks are moving, the whole earth trembles, and the guns fire, but the soldier just sits.
А солдаты сидят.
Soviet aircraft took off at dawn to wreck the German bombers waiting on their airfields. The Germans kept to the timetable. On the morning of July the 5th, the Panzer divisions moved forward. Kursk was the biggest tank battle in history. In the north, the German pincer made 10 miles in 5 days and halted, with 50,000 dead and 400 tanks destroyed. In the south, in an even vaster battle, a 20-mile dent was made in the Russian defenses, but the Germans were spent. On July the 15th, Hitler called off the Kursk offensive. The Red Army went over to the attack. Under bombardment, the sappers went ahead to cut a path into the German defenses. Through the gap, the tanks plunged forward, the troops riding on their sides. These were the new Russian soldiers, very different from the defeated masses of 1941. Their clothes were shabby, but their weapons were clean. They were tough, chasing the enemy into close-quarter battle. They were resourceful, trained to live off the land and to cross rivers on their own. If there was no boat, a bench or a log would do. They went without regular leave or pay, but now their morale was fierce and high. In military terms, it was Kursk which decided how the European war would end. When this supreme German effort failed, the Soviet victory began. At first, the fighting to break through the German positions was hard and slow, but after 9 days, the Red Army had recaptured all the ground lost in this last German offensive. The Germans began to fall back, destroying everything as they went. But now they were under constant attack by Soviet fighters. The Luftwaffe had lost command of the air. Suddenly, the towns of occupied Russia were full of armor moving west. After 2 years, the conquerors were pulling out. At Leningrad, the Germans were still at the outskirts. The city still under shell fire. The siege was not to be finally broken until January of the following year. The strength of Russia, like a gigantic spring compressed back to its limit, was now bursting forward. The first cities were liberated. On August the 5th, 1943, Oryel and Belgorod were free. In each town, those who had died in battle were buried. Do not call me, Father. Do not seek me. Do not call me. Do not wish me back. We're on a route uncharted. Fire and blood erase our track. On we fly, on wings of thunder, never more to sheath our swords, all of us in battle fallen, not to be brought back by words. Will there be a rendezvous? I know not. I only know we still must fight. We are sand grains in infinity, never to meet, never more see life. Farewell then, my son. Farewell then, my conscience. My youth and my solace, my one and my only. And let this farewell be the end of a story of solitude vast, than which none is more lonely, in which you remain barred forever and ever from light and from air, with your death pangs untold, untold and unsoothed, not to be resurrected forever and ever, an 18-year-old. Farewell then. No trains ever come from those regions, unscheduled or scheduled. No aeroplanes fly there. Farewell then, my son, for no miracles happen, as in this world dreams do not come true. Farewell. I will dream of you still as a baby, treading the earth with little strong toes, the earth where already so many lie buried. This song to my son, then, is come to its close. In Moscow, Stalin announced, tonight at 2400 hours on August the 5th, the capital of our country, Moscow, will salute the valiant troops who liberated Oryel and Belgorod. Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the struggle for the freedom of our country. Death to the German invaders. In November, Kiev was freed. Russia was saved by its soldiers and by its people. But in the earth, never to welcome the coming of peace, lay 20 million dead.